So in the last lesson, we were understanding about the IP addressing system. Now, in this lesson, we'll understand Azure Virtual Network. So this will try to understand Azure Virtual Network, and we'll try to understand subnets and how the IP addressing system will be allocated and what number of IP addresses which we will going to get in a virtual network. So Azure Virtual Network. So Azure Virtual Network is a private network in Azure. Like how we can set up a network in the on-premises, having a switches connected to the switch and assigning a IP addressing system and establish a communication between the resources like the servers, desktops, laptops, and everything. Similarly, in Azure, we can create our own network. We can choose our own IP addressing system, IP address, and which is basically a secure network in Azure, which we call it as an isolated network. So this network does not collide with anyone else. So there could be a lot of customers which exist in Azure, but this network is dedicated to us. So no customers can get access to this network. It is completely isolated. And Azure network is basically specific to the region and subscription. So one virtual network cannot span across the regions, and one virtual network cannot span across the subscriptions. So if you have a multiple subscriptions, then we might need to create multiple virtual networks. If you are using resources in multiple regions, then we need to create a networks in multiple regions. One subscription, a subscription can have multiple VNets. So VNets, what we call it as a virtual networks. So in a short form, we'll be using a terminology called as an VNet. But under a single subscription, we can create multiple virtual networks. So when you go to that, this is my Azure region. We'll take Azure region. So this is, let me take the subscription as a primary, because subscription is across this one. So under this Azure subscription, we have using two different regions. So this is my Azure, I would say Central India. And this is my Azure West India. So as I said, so when you have multiple regions, we cannot have a single virtual network across the regions. So within the subscription, we can create multiple virtual networks. Now within the Azure Central India, so we can have a virtual network. We can have a virtual network. And in Azure West India, we can have Azure Virtual Network. Now this is an Azure Virtual Network. Azure Virtual Networks. Like this, we can create a multiple virtual networks in Azure. So as we see in this one, within the same subscription, so I'm giving a subscription name called as an acute learn subscription. So I'm going to have two different regions where my virtual machines or some other resources are going to create. Now, so if we're going to have two different regions, then we need to create two different virtual networks. Now within the region, you can also have multiple virtual networks within the same subscription. So within the same region, also, you can have multiple virtual networks. So I'm saying a virtual network called as a production. And I'm giving Azure Virtual Network called as a prod. I'm giving it central prod. So I'm calling it as a West prod. So in many organizations, we might have multiple environments like development, test, production environment. So we can create multiple virtual networks under one particular region. So now I can have a central called as a dev network. And we can have another network called as an Azure West development. Like this, we can create multiple virtual networks under one single region also within the subscription. Now, one virtual network is completely isolated from another virtual network. So this is a separate virtual network. This is a separate virtual network. By default, there is no communication between these two virtual networks. And by default, there is no communication between the virtual networks within the Azure. So now I created four virtual networks in Azure. Now all these four virtual networks will not communicate with each other. A virtual network needs an IP address space. And a virtual network can have multiple subnets. Now, so yesterday we were talking about an IP addressing system. So we see a class A, which is starting from 0 to 127, and class B, which is starting from 128 to 191, and class C, which is starting from 192 to 223. Now here we get some 1 crore 67 lakh something 76,000 something host per network. And here we get somewhere around 65,500 hosts per network. And here we get a 256 hosts per network. Now we can choose which class you want to assign for a virtual network. Now, does your network is a larger network, larger number of devices? Then we can go for a class A. And your organization is not that big and you're not going to have resources in such a big way. Then you can go for a class B. And your network is not basically very big and it's very too small. And your resources, the number of virtual machines or the resources which are going to connect are very less. Then we can go for class C of it. Okay. And when you are choosing it, an IP address space and what IP series. You have to use a private IP series. So we should not choose a public IP address series. We need to choose a private IP address space. So during the creation of a virtual network, the virtual network will need to provide an IP address space. Now I'm giving a case called as, and I'm choosing called as a 192.168.1.0/24. That is 255.255.255.0. This is also being written as 24. So sometimes it is being written as 24, and sometimes it is basically like this. So now this one, I'm using a 2.0 network, a 2.0 network. And I'm choosing a 3.0 network. I'm choosing a class C 4.0 network. Now, there are 4 virtual networks got created. Now, for one network, we're using 190.168.1.0, the class C network, and which is a private IP network. So for another one, we are using a 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0. Like this for each and every virtual network. Now for 2 virtual network, you can have the same IP address series. You can have the same IP address series, but in future, if you want to establish a communication between these 2 virtual networks, if both the virtual networks IP address series is the same, then we cannot establish the communication. So it is the best practice that ensure that the unique IP series, IP address series is chosen for each virtual network, for each virtual network. So unique IP address series is chosen for each virtual network. So make sure that in future, and if you're not aware of it, if already in the on-prem, if you're using some IP address series, make sure that we are not using the same IP address series in Azure, because in future, when we want to establish a communication between the on-prem and Azure, then we will have problems. Then we'll have the problems of it. So we should ensure that the unique IP address series is B, and make sure that you cross-check before you creating the network. Now within the virtual network, what is required now? So now when I go to the environments, so we'll say when we say production environment, you might have some like in a web servers. I'm taking an example, environment. So you have a web servers, you have database servers, you have application servers. Okay. You have like SAP servers, you have some kind of an Oracle servers, or you have some kind of an infrastructure servers. Okay. Like your infrastructure servers, like AD, DHCP, DNS, like many things, etc., etc. These things. Okay. So what do we need here now? We need some kind of a security. Even though they're all part of the same network, but I don't want the web servers to communicate with database servers. I don't want the database servers to communicate with web servers. I want only the application servers. I want SAP servers to communicate with infrastructure servers. Now, so why we have this environment? We need additional level of security. So I want to keep all the web servers which are facing to the internet and I separate this thing, a database servers. We want to achieve some kind of a security over there. We want to achieve some kind of a security. So how do we basically do that now? So in order to achieve these kind of things, we create called as a subnets. We use called as a subnets within the network to isolate the environments, or I would say isolate the servers or basically resources. So what is a subnet? So when you look at the subnet is basically a portion of a virtual network or a portion of a network which can be isolated from another portion. A portion. So what does subnets will do as a subnet allows to divide a larger network or basically a network into a smaller networks. So we can use a subnet. So this allows to divide a network into smaller networks. Now, when I go to the 19.168. When I go to the 19.168.1.0/24, now I have 256 hosts in this network. So we can further divide this. We can divide this into smaller networks like 2 networks, 4 networks, like 8 networks, like 16, like 32, like 64, like we can say called as a 128. But to be frank, 128 may not be possible as part of the network. So we can say called as 64 networks. So it means that we can divide this network into smaller networks. So as I was taking an example of so if you have a 256 apples, now you need to divide this into multiple groups, groups or buckets, what you can call it as. Now, how can we do that? So we can basically do you want to keep 4 apples into one bucket? Or do you want to keep 8 apples into one bucket, or 16 apples into one bucket, or 32 apples into one bucket? Like, how do you want to do that? Now that's where divide it. Now, how do we divide it now? So this allows to divide smaller networks, provides an additional classification of, or basically classification of resources, can provide some additional security features. So with the help of subnets, we can restrict the communication between the smaller networks. Now, what is the advantage of subnets is we can save the IP address. So we can, instead of having 192.168.1.0 as one single network, hardly I'm going to use 5 or 6 servers in each environment. Now, why do I need to use a separate networks for each and everything? Instead of that, so I can take one bigger network and divide that into smaller networks. Now, I go to the subnet calculator. So I'm using 192.168.1.0. The default subnet mask is a 24. Now, how many subnets you want to divide? So I want to divide this into 4 different subnets. So when I divide this into 4 subnets, so what I'm trying to do is here is that I'm dividing this 256 host into 4 different smaller networks. Now in this case, 256 divided by 4. So we'll have 444 or 64, 64, 64. So when I divide this into 4, we'll have 64 hosts in one subnet. Now, so like that, we'll have 4 different subnets. Now, so what I'm trying to do here now, so I have an 192.168.256 host. Now I'm dividing this into 4 subnets. So 192.168.1.0 to 190.168.1.63 is my subnet 1. 190.168.1.64 to 190.168.1.127 is the subnet 2. 192.168.1.128 to 190.168.1.191 is my subnet 3. 192.168.1.192 to 192.168.1.256. Sorry, 255 is my subnet 3. Subnet 4. So in each subnet, so we'll have 64 hosts. So this is having a 64 host. So this is having a 64 host. This can have a 64 host. This can have a 64 host, or I can say 64 IP addresses, because we divided this 256 into a 4 like this. Now we can have up to 62 devices connected here. We can have 62 devices connected, 62 devices connected, 62 devices. Now, in this particular subnet, the starting value is 0, ending value is 63. Ending value is 63 of it. So as per to the TCP/IP protocol, the first IP address is a network identification, and the last IP address, the subnet or whatever we called as network, is basically called as a broadcast address. So these two will tell that the starting portion and ending portion of the IP address. Now, the first and last IP addresses should not be assigned to the devices, as per to the TCP/IP protocol. Now, when I say 192.168.1.0 and 63, the first IP address, that is my 192.168.1.0, is my first IP address. So I should not assign this IP address to any device. Now, what is the last IP address in this network? 192.168.1.63. So in this subnet, the first and last IP address we should not assign to any device. So what happens here now? So I'm giving 192.168.1.0, I cannot assign to anyone, and 1.63, I cannot assign to anything. Now, out of 64, the 2 IP addresses you cannot assign. So you get 62 usable IP addresses. So I'm talking at a very high level. Maybe I would recommend that if you're not aware of the IP addressing system, go through some YouTube videos or something which can help you to understand very detailed about this IP addressing system. Okay, but just for the sake of understanding an Azure Virtual Network, I'm just talking from a very high level. Now, we are going to create 4 subnets. Now, like this, within the So within this virtual network, we can create subnets. Subnet 1, subnet 2. Like this, you can create multiple subnets. And within this particular network, you can create multiple subnets. I'm trying to create 3 subnets. This is a subnets. Now I can say subnet. We can give a name like a web servers. And we can say 192.168.1.0 slash 255.255.255. Let's see what is the subnet mask. It is talking about 26. 20. I'll put like this as in 26. So we can have web servers. We can say called as an app servers. This is another subnet. And I'm starting from 64 because this one. Like this, you can create, I'm saying called as a web server. Okay. Web server, I'm giving 192.168.2.0/26. I can say called as app servers as a subnet and 192.168.2.64/26. And you can say called as a DB servers 192.168.2.128/6026. So you can have a subnets under a single virtual network. Now, based on the requirement, how many subnets you want, so you can create them, but each and every subnet should not get overlap. Should not get overlap. So you have to decide that you want a 64 IP addresses in each subnet or 32 IP addresses in each subnet. Now, if I go here, so I want to 32 IP addresses. Now we can see 30 IP addresses, usable IP addresses. Now I'm dividing this into 8 subnets so that in each subnet I get 32 IP addresses and 30 are the usable IP addresses. And we can see starting from subnet 0.27, 32.27, 64.27, we can say 96.127. Now, starting value, which you can assign it, ending IP address, broadcast IP network, and broadcast IP addresses. Okay, so based on the need to need basis, you just calculate your subnets and you can basically assign it. Now, as a site, okay, so by default, let's look at how we can create the virtual networks and subnets. Right. So I'm going to the virtual networks. So we have one subscription. I'm creating a virtual network. You can search for a virtual network here, or you can go here and you'll find it virtual networks, or you can search over here. Now subscription, under which subscription? If you have multiple subscription, you can choose it. I'm creating a resource group called as an RG-Acute I'm saying called as a Central India. Central India. So virtual network name, I'm giving it the called as an AL-prod-VNet. Based on organization name to name, sometimes people will use the name of the resource called as like this and basically called as a prod like this. Now VNet, I'm saying prod. Region, I'm saying Central India. Next, IP address. By default in Azure, it chooses a 10.0.0.0 as the default. So I'm saying delete an address space, add an address space. I'm giving it 19.168.1.0/24. Now this is the virtual network address space. This is the virtual network address space. 19.161.network. Now under this, I want to create subnets. So we can create a subnet. So I'm giving 1.0 IP address range. And IP, how many IP addresses you want it? So we can see called as 16 addresses, 32 address, 64 address. And name, I'm giving it called as a web servers. Subnet. Subnet web servers. So what I'm choosing here now, 198.168.1.0 to 1. Basically 64 IP addresses, which is going to come. I'm giving called as a 0 value. Now we can see 0 to 163, 0 to 63. Add. Now we can create multiple subnet. So I'm creating one more subnet called as an app servers. App servers. So I'm giving it here. How many IP addresses you want it? 64 IP addresses, starting from 64. Now if I give it 0, because already we created one subnet starting with 0. So I cannot create a one more subnet with the same values. We can see is overlaps with the following subnet. So I need to choose 64. Now the starting value is 64, ending is in 127. Like this, we can create subnets within the virtual network and say create. Create. So I'm creating. Let's wait for this one to complete. Yeah. I'm going to the virtual networks. Now we can see a VNet production virtual network. Click on that. And you'll be able to see an address space. What we have chosen called as in here. If this is not sufficient, later you can add one more IP address space. Go to subnets. Now we can see two subnets which we got created. So later I can create another subnet. I'm giving subnet a database servers. Starting value. So 128/28, I'm giving it starting from 128 to 143. So I'm going to reduce this. So I need 128 to 159 is basically 27 plus. I'm giving it 26 because we need 64 IP addresses. Now save it. So later point of time, you can add subnets. You can add subnets based on requirement to requirement. Now, I'm creating one more virtual network with the same subscription, same resource group. I'm giving it vnet-development. Development. So under Central India. So I'm going to the address. Now I'm choosing address space as 19.168.2.0/24/24. Now let's create the subnets. Now in 24 series, what I'm trying to do is let me 2.0. So I'm going to put 8 subnets. In each subject, 30, 2 IP addresses, 30 usable. Now 2.0 is a subnet. Starting value 1 to 30. 1 to 30. Now I'm saying here 32 IP addresses. Starting IP address 2.0. And let me give a name. I'm called as in dev web servers. I'm creating one more subnet. SN-. I'm giving it dev-app servers. Now 32 IP addresses starting from already I used 0. So the next one is my 32. So I'm choosing 32. Now review and create. Review and create. For creating a virtual network, Azure will not charge you anything. But once you start enabling additional features on top of the virtual network, then he will charge you. So I'm going to the virtual networks. I'm creating one more virtual network. So I'm creating a resource group hyphen called as a West India. So I'm giving an vnet-West India. I'm selecting in West India. I'm going to the address space. So I'm going to use 192.168.3.0/24. I'm creating a subnet. So I'm giving it subnet-web servers. So starting from 3.0, I want 64 IP addresses in one network, and I want another 64. I'm giving SN-app servers. Then I'm giving it 3.64 is the starting value, and 27 is this one. Now add it, review and create. So what we did now, so we created 2 virtual networks in Central India and another virtual network in West India. We'll create another virtual network in West India, as basically I should have given production. Okay, no problem. So let's go to the virtual networks. So I selected West India. Okay. So I'm creating another virtual network under West India. I'm giving it vnet-West India-development. IP addressing space, I'm giving it 19.168.4.0/24. So I'm going to create subnets, subnet web servers. 4.0, and need 32 IP addresses in each subnet. I'm creating one more subnet, -app servers. starting from 32 IP addresses, and I'm creating one more subnet, SN-, and database servers. Then it starts from 64, 32 IP address, add it, and review and create. Okay. Now we created 4 different virtual networks. So in 2 different regions. So we can have multiple virtual networks in one single region under a subscription. Now, so Azure will IP address allocation to resources. Now, when I take a subnet of 192.168.1.0 to 192.168.1.63, which is we are getting 64 host. Now, starting IP address, what is this? IP address in this one, 192.168.1.0, which we called as a network address. We cannot assign this to anything. And ending IP within this subnet is 192.168.1.63, which we called as a broadcast IP address. We cannot assign this to. Now, by default, Azure will enable a DSCP services on the virtual network. So when we create a virtual network, the Azure will enable a DSCP services on the virtual network, and the DSCP services will automatically assign the IP address to the resources when connected. So when I'm creating a virtual machine, I can choose a virtual network, and within the virtual network, which subnet I need to connect. So as soon as we create a virtual machine and that's connected to that subnet, and the DSCP will automatically assign IP address to that one. The DSCP will automatically assign the IP address to that one. Okay. So by default, the DSCP services will be enabled. So we don't need to do that. Now the DSCP will be in Azure. The first IP is what we called as a network ID. A second IP is called as a gateway IP. The third IP is a DNS server IP. The fourth IP is a DNS server IP. And the last IP is called as a broadcast IP address. Broadcast IP address. It's called as a broadcast IP. So what Azure will do is now. So 192.168.1.0 is my network ID. 192.168.1.1 within the subnet is my second IP address, which is going to act like a gateway. And third IP address, which is 192.168.1.2, is going to act like a DNS server. And 192.168.1.3 is going to act like a DHCP server. And broadcast is 192.168.1.63 is going to act like this one. Now, these are reserved IP addresses. We call them these as reserved IP addresses. We call them these as reserved IP addresses. Now, these IP addresses are not assigned. Now, the DHCP scope, will be 19.168.1.4 to 19.168.1.62. The DHCP scope will be 19.168.1.4 to 19.168.1.62. Will be 62. So in each subnet, we will get 5 IP addresses will not be allocated. So remaining one, we will get it. So when we go to the virtual network, go to subnets, we can see 27 are available. Out of 32 what we created, 27 are available. 27 are available. Okay. So now I'm going to the virtual machine. Create a virtual machine. So when I'm creating a virtual machine, I'm choosing a West India. I'm VM1. I'm trying to create Windows virtual machine. So it is saying request a quota. Already 10 are there. Sorry. Celia, why West India? I'm selecting B family series. D4 family. Quota is 4. New request. New limit, I'm saying 15. Okay. Let me go ahead and create. Let me choose. There is nothing else here. Site is not available. Oh. Let's wait for this one to finish. Now, meanwhile, let's go ahead and basically, yeah, it would take some time. I need Create a virtual machine. West India. VM1. Let me choose a different region for now. Why it is not allowing me to do that? Central India. Zone 1. Okay. Let's choose Central India. So I'm just selecting 2 CPUs with 8 GB RAM. I'm giving Azure user public inbound ports. Next, disks. So under the networking, now we can choose which VNet you want to have. Now we create a production VNet and dev VNet. So I'm selecting a production dev VNet. Under production VNet virtual network, we have created multiple subnets. So under which subnet you want to connect this server? And you want to have a public IP? No. And say review and create. And create. Now we connected this particular virtual machine to this virtual VNet. So I'm creating another virtual machine. I'm selecting Central India resource group. I'm giving it VM3, Central India. So I'm selecting a virtual network dev. And within that, we can see multiple subnets. I'm selecting a web servers. I don't need a public IP. And review and create. Let's wait for the virtual machines to get complete. Let's go to the first virtual machine. So when I go to the first virtual machine, in the network, we can see VNet prod, SN web servers. And when I go to the network, so I see a private IP got assigned 192.168.1.4, which has been assigned. And this is the basically series. Now we can see it has been assigned with 4. VM3 2.4. So as I said, the starting value will be the 4, basically the 5th IP address. So it's starting from the 5th of the IP address and is basically getting assigned to this one. Okay. So this is how we can create Azure virtual networks and create subnets and how the IP addressing system will be assigned. Now, when we go to the virtual networks, connected devices, now we can see there is a one virtual machine which is got connected to this one. Yeah, in the next lesson, we'll try to understand the network security groups, how we can enable the security on the subnets.